Hello and welcome to yet another video. And in this video it's going to be something different because this is a requested video by two of the viewers after I released this video of the M50, like based on my opinion on it. And in there I explained about part of my photography job is to photograph events and conferences. And some of them, well, two of them specifically asked me, well, one of them asked me for tips and tricks and the other one asked me about my setup during this type of situations. Now, first, before I get into the video, I have to say that this is pretty much based on how I shoot and also the equipment that I have, as well as like what I see that matches within that situation that I'm shooting. If you're shooting different types of event photography, different types of conference photography, the settings and the setup that I use may not be applicable to you, but I hope this video will help you guys to a certain extent at least, or help you guys somewhat with deciding the settings or equipment to take or the equipment to invest in if you're thinking of doing this type of photography as well, or if you're already doing and looking for maybe how other photographers are doing it. That being said, I'm not the best photographer, and I'm sure other photographers will have different settings, different setup that works for them, and this is what works for me. And if, as you can see, I do have L lenses right here, and I do not use it all the time with my EOS M50, and it's just from my professional full frame setup as well. That's why I have it at my disposal, and I don't need to invest in other lenses because it's from my portrait, my wedding, my other event photography that I use, like otherwise would have used with my full frame cameras, with my 5D Mark II, 5D Mark III, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I'm not bragging, don't get me wrong, but this is why I have these lenses, because I am also sharing it with my other system, just to save the cost on me as well. Anyway, let's get started into the video, and first I would like to start with the least used lens that I use during my conference photography and event photography, which is this 11 to 22 millimeter from Canon, and it's the native glass, the native EFM lens for the M series. It is a great sharp lens with really nice contrast control, but for event photography and conferences, things like that, where you're usually, at least in my case, I'm usually in a lot of dimly lit situations, as well as like a lot of artificial lighting. This lens is only really useful if the event starts like before sunset, and just allow me to get that story image of like how the whole event was like. And after the event starts for a little bit, I quickly have to put this lens away and start using more of my tighter lenses where I have more or bigger aperture opening for the light to hit into the sensor, because I definitely need that extra light, because as the event progresses, there are definitely more stories, more things to capture, more emotions, more reactions, more detail to capture, that I don't want to be using too high ISO and too low of a shutter speed to get the like right color or right exposure for the image to make it sharp. So yeah, then I have to resort to these lenses. And let me just introduce the lenses right away. I would use my 22 millimeter because it's such a light lens. I also have it on the gimbal sometimes if I'm doing hybrid shooting with video. So this lens is also not so much in photography, but in videography, when I have to switch from photo mode to video mode, and I would have this on the gimbal. The f2 on this lens really helps a lot, especially its compact size of the lens, that I don't need such a big gimbal to work with. But I do use this quite a bit for photography as well, for event and conferences, just not as much as these three. So that would be my second least used lens. Obviously I have these three lenses adapted to my EOS M50, and most of the time I will be using this lens and this lens, the 24-70 f2.8. This is the original first version, so you can even get this secondhand for really affordable price nowadays, even though it's an L lens. But because it's an f2.8 all the way through, and it's such a nicely built quality lens, and though it's not as sharp, nowhere as sharp as the newer L version of this lens, and even the more modern non-L version of this lens, but having such a flexibility with the focal range, the fixed aperture of f2.8, and the build quality that I've dropped it many times and still survived. That's why I decided to borrow this from my photography full frame side down to this as well, and just share it because of all the practicality and efficiency and the speed that I can pretty much use this lens with in many types of scenarios. And as you can probably imagine, because these are all, apart from this lens, these are all really wide aperture, really big aperture lenses. I mainly shoot with big aperture, wide open. And which leads me to these two. These two are my most used lenses. Overall, it's the f1.8 and the f1.2. This is more like an equivalent of 135 millimeter. And this is also more of like an 80 or 85 millimeter equivalent, but these two allows me to get different types of image that my 5D Mark III wouldn't be able to get if I'm switching, especially with this form factor, because if you're especially in a business conference where more people are more aware of cameras rather than in like certain events where people are more natural with cameras, I actually feel better using smaller setup with my M50 than my 5D Mark III, and it just allows me to get different types of natural emotions when people have questions, when people are thinking, when people are just focusing or concentrating or writing notes on what's going on. You know, so these two are pretty much my secret weapon, and it's not a lot when I need ultra wide angle, but it's the image that sells more, or that is more interesting, so to speak, are from these two lenses, because they really focus on not only specific details on people, but specific details on what's going on, the event itself, the reaction, and things like that. And these two lenses allows me to use lower ISO as well to get a nicer, cleaner image. Though I have to admit, I don't really use, especially, well, with this lens I use under ISO 1000, but with this lens I still have to keep up with like 1200 or sometimes 2500 and sometimes 3200. I try to keep it below 3200. 3200 is already grainy, but let's be real, 24 megapixels, if you're a photographer, it might not sound a lot. But if you're a client, like your client who's, you know, he's not very technical and only need the photo for like A3 prints and some poster size prints, 24 megapixels is so much for that already. Like, you can do it within 12 megapixels. So with ISO 3200 with such a bright aperture, it's still relatively clean, and I could trade some of the resolution with the denoising feature and get even a cleaner image. So that's usually my workflow when the event gets way too dark and the lighting gets way too tricky, because sometimes, or a lot of times, they will be turning on projectors, so it's even harder to get the facial reaction of the audience or the talent themselves, because they're usually backlit by the projectors themselves. Yeah, so what I usually would do for that is underexpose a little bit, but just a little bit. And by underexposing, I already have the ability to lower down the ISO a little bit, yet maintain fast enough shutter speed for capturing that moment without blurriness, so that they remain sharp. Especially, it will be very helpful when these two lenses aren't image stabilized either. I don't know how I'm talking today. It's been a pretty long day. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I'm trying my best to explain this, because I usually don't get asked a lot when it comes to taking pictures at events and conferences, because that's what I'm not really known for. I do that, but it's only a small part of what I do as a living. It's not such a big part. Anyway, back into the topic. And because of how easy the EOS M50 is to operate with the touchscreen, I already see what I'm going to get with these lenses. And this lens, especially the 50mm, doesn't need to be this particular model. It can be the non-STM or even the Yongnuo model. But there's something about mounting a 50mm on here that's equivalent of around 85mm that creates certain flare on the sensor, not on the lens, but on the sensor. It's not distracting, but it creates it in a very subtle way that I kind of like it, and I always play with it. And if you have a 50mm lens, this might actually be useful. But my tip will always be like, shoot a lot of details because they tell more story in a different way. You can always go wide, at least for like how I shoot my events. You can always show wide, but there's very little to tell about wide angle. You can shoot maybe 3, 4, maximum 5, 6 shots per story that's taking place in the event, and then quickly change to these tighter lenses, which tells more detail, tells more story, yet allows cleaner images because it focuses more on certain event that's happening, certain features, certain emotions, things like that. I know I'm repeating myself, but I just have to stress enough that these lenses really help. Even though this is like what, only 100 euros, but it will guarantee to give you a lot of different types of images coming out if you're doing event photography, conference photography, things like that. And you really need to focus on the emotions and storytelling at the same time, yet having that nice blurry background and blurry foreground, and also having more control of the lighting, because with the lower aperture, like the smaller aperture opening lenses, you don't really have as much control over the lighting as these big aperture lenses, and that's really the main tip I can give. Because when it comes to framing and everything, because event photography and conference photography involves so many different types of conditions and situations, I don't think that my personal situation of event photography and conference photography will actually help you guys that much. But in terms of equipment and settings, I wouldn't really go above 2500. Sometimes I would go 3200, but if I really have these lenses at their max aperture of either 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, so that I still have a bit cleaner image and trade in some of the resolution to clean off the image later. But yeah, that has been this video. I hope you find it somewhat useful. I'm not sure how useful it is, but yeah, that would be my answer to the requested part of like my setup, and also my small tips and tricks of what I would do in conference photography. Yeah, mainly just dive into the details and storytelling. That would be the part that I would do. Anyway, if you need a free photography guidebook for absolute beginners, it's free on my website. You don't need to put in your email address, no registration, nothing. It's completely free. I will not bombard you with newsletters, things like that. So yeah, if you need that, it's on my website. It's also in the link in the description below. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, any suggestions, or any tips to share with other people, also feel free to comment down in the description below, or send me a direct message either on YouTube or on Instagram. A lot of you have sent me on Facebook, and usually I answer that like very late because I don't usually use Facebook that often, and yeah, it's just I prefer privacy as well in that regard. And yeah, thank you very much for watching, and have fun shooting. Bye.